Welcome back to SteelCast. I can't quite believe it's 5 years since we started doing this podcast. Of course, that was back in the days of COVID in 2020, and we did the podcast then as a way of getting to some of our workers who are either on furlough or not in work or our contractor partners. I guess shortly after that, 3 years ago, almost to the day, we started doing this series about decarbonising the steel industry. So here we are 3 years on, we're in front of the Houses of Parliament today, and that will become clear when I introduce my guests and start talking about the topic we're going to talk about today. Now, lots happened in those 3 years, of course. You know, not only have we received government funding to support the 1.25 billion investment in Port Talbot Steelworks on our journey to green steel making. More recently, we've submitted planning permission for the electric arc furnace. We've had an agreement with Tenova to supply the electric arc furnace itself. We've had the agreement with JCB, the Memorandum of Understanding, to source green steel from us. And we're just going through a host of contracts with contractor partners to do the work on the Port Talbot site. Of course, also in those 3 years, we've had the sad times of having to close iron and steel making on the Port Talbot site and the job losses that go with that. But here we are, 3 years on, and we're firmly on our way to decarbonising the UK steel industry, firmly on our journey to low CO2 steel and a sustainable steel industry. Or have we? And I guess that's the reason we're here today, because investing in capital equipment is one thing. Brand new electric arc furnace could be one of the biggest in the world. But if the policy framework around our industry in the UK isn't supportive, can the industry be as successful as we want it to be? Now, only last December, we had the Parliamentary Summit just round the corner here in Portcullis House, hosted by UK Steel, which was entitled Shaping the Steel Strategy. And we talked to lots of people at that event about the policy requirements that the industry needs the government to continue with to create that policy environment. And in that light, I'm delighted to be joined today here at the House of Parliament by Tom Evans. Tom, you're Head of Public Affairs. Now, it was a hell of an event in December, wasn't it? You know, a lot of people there, full house, opening by Johnny Reynolds. You know, the steel sector, if you looked at the agenda of that day, is in quite a good place. We've got a steel strategy being formulated, we've got a steel council, we've got steel round tables. The government's announced £2.5 billion of funding for the steel sector. Lots of sectors would bite off their arms to be in our position, wouldn't they, Tom?
They would indeed, yeah. And I think it was a really good way to end the year and also start this year, because obviously we had an election last year, so change of government. We've got a government, as you say, that's very invested in the steel industry, who did a lot of work before the election to kind of gather their thoughts so they can hit the ground running in terms of taking office and preparing for government. So I think we're in quite a good position. It was a good way to end the year, as I've already said, because it allowed us to kind of reflect on all the progress which has been made over the last 2-3 years, but also to look ahead and to ask ourselves kind of what do we need to make the steel industry work, because as you've identified, one part of it is that kind of the capital investment which is required in the steel industry to decarbonise steel works and steel operations. But then the other part of it is this kind of almost ingredients list of policies which will be required for any steel company operating in the UK for their steel decarbonisation. So The best way to look at it is that kind of the capital investment which is required, but also alongside it the policy framework which will be required for the future.
Yeah, we've got a policy briefing document, and I think you and a colleague Lewis have pulled together with some other colleagues within the company, which is kind of Tata Steel specific, although many of the issues are relevant to the whole steel industry. And you know, whilst many people will say, look, your work, Tata Steel, over the next 3 years is putting that arc furnace in, putting a pickle line in, upgrading the casters and all that capex work that has to go on, but actually if we don't get the policy framework sorted out, you know, the business is not going to be sustainable in the long term. And so I guess the reason for getting you on the pod today, Tom, and I'm very grateful for your time coming out here in the cold February weather to join us, is to maybe talk through some of those policy asks of the government that we and others in our industry need some support on. So we'll try and run through them one by one, and I've got a bit of an aid memoir because I remember them, because there's quite a few, aren't there?
Yep.
And the first one, I guess if we start internationally and then move into sort of domestically, the first one is about imports, cheap imports. Now the steel industry suffered from cheap imports for a long time, almost as long as I can remember. You know, isn't this part of just what a free market economy is? What is it we're asking the government to do in terms of cheap imports?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a really good question, Tim, and very kind of on topic at the moment, because just yesterday evening, Trump announced a new raft of tariffs on steel going into the US. So it's a very personal subject. At the moment, we have the steel safeguards, which, if you recall, were renewed last summer. Those are going to be in force until 2026, summer 2026, so they last 2 years. It's a good thing they've been renewed. They provide us with those kind of temporary protections on how much steel can be imported into the UK, but they're temporary measures by their very nature. So we have to look to the future, and we have to look at kind of what's the right balance between what the UK is proposing, what Europe is proposing, and what the US is proposing to insulate the countries, or your country, from the overcapacity that exists in the global steel market at the moment. So we know there's an incredible high amount of steel in the global market at the moment, and that's why countries like the UK, countries like the US and Europe need to figure out kind of what level of protections are required for the domestic steel industry, because if there are none, we'll be at the whim of all sorts of incredibly challenging trade winds. So I think it's incredibly important for us as a country to figure out what the right balance is between trade protections and a global free open market, because we also export a lot of our steel around the world. So
yeah, because the free marketeers may cry foul, but the truth is, I guess, we're probably not really operating in a free market when countries around the world have got state subsidies. And a topic we'll jump onto in a second is about carbon taxes, for example. So if you're not in a free market, then the government has a choice to let you succeed or fail, or to try and make a level playing field, or to try and even things up. That's pretty much what we're asking, is it?
Yeah, that's precisely what we're asking for, and I think a level playing field is a consistent theme throughout all the policy asks. So we're asking for a level playing field on energy costs, as we've already identified. We're looking for a level playing field on things like trade, because as you correctly said, other steel companies across the world don't face the same level of costs that UK trading steel companies face. So it's incredibly important for us to level that playing field for the UK, and to ensure a sustainable future for any steel business here in the UK.
So one of the other things, Tom, there about imports, the difficulty of imports, is a thing called the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Martin Brunnock mentioned it in his last podcast. Could you explain exactly what that is for listeners who may not be au fait with that terminology, and why it's important not only that we have one, but that we align with our European neighbours?
Sure, yep. So both the UK and the EU are proposing a carbon border adjustment mechanism, so that's important, and that issue of alignment is important because we want the carbon border adjustment mechanism to come online around the same time as the European equivalent. I think, just in a nutshell, what a carbon border adjustment mechanism is it's a tariff which will be applied on carbon intensive goods. It ensures that you pay the correct amount of tariff or tax on the amount of carbon that's in your product. So it's incredibly important for us because, going back to what you said earlier around leveling the playing field, it ensures that everyone pays the fair price for the amount of carbon that's in their product. It will also help industries that are decarbonising quicker than others, like ours, like the UK, because it means that our goods won't pay such a high carbon border adjustment mechanism if they were to export to the European Union. But other goods, if they're from carbon intensive countries or processes, will pay a higher cost. So would it be fair to say that because in the UK and the EU we have imposed carbon taxes on energy intensive industries like ours, that puts us at a competitive disadvantage compared to countries who don't put a carbon tax on? And so what we're asking the government to do is say, well,
tax those imports to the same level as native industries are being taxed, and then kind of you're on your own, you're on a level playing field then, aren't you?
That's precisely it. And what we're proposing isn't punitive for countries that export to the UK. All we're proposing is a level playing field, as you've said, that reflects the cost of carbon in each of the countries where the steel is made.
Yeah.
So it's an idea that we've kind of a proposal that we've called for a very long time. And I think if you look at the kind of the timing in terms of its implementation, it's well kind of suited to our electric arc furnace construction timeline, because it should come in. Both should come online around 2027. So the idea is then you can look at kind of holistically the entire way that carbon leakage is regulated in the UK. So you've got also a knock-on effect in terms of how much carbon taxes we pay. So the idea being that carbon border adjustment mechanism is the future, and the carbon border, the EU ETS, or the carbon emission tax that we currently pay in the UK, the price that will be levelled on people bring in the steel into the UK will be the price that they pay, the carbon border.
Yeah, and I think the term we've used before is, we don't want to hand out, we want to hand up. And I think everything that we're asking for is to create this level playing field and say, and all other things we're happy to compete on, price, service, quality and so forth. But there's some stuff that we can't do on ourselves, and the government has to. Which brings me on to maybe the noisiest topic in our industry over recent years, which is energy costs.
Yeah.
And again, almost as long as I can remember, we've been saying to the UK government, energy costs for energy intensive industries in the UK are out of kilter with our European peers, and figures of 50% higher or 75% higher than France and Germany have been bandied around. What can we expect the government to do about energy costs for industries like ours to get us on that level playing field?
Yep, so energy costs I think are our number one issue at the moment. And if you look at kind of what's been said since the Labour government was elected, it's kind of the number one theme running throughout the conversation around our future industrial competitiveness. So I think it's a huge issue for us as steelmakers, because the cost of energy, the cost that we pay for our energy is put onto the cost of the steel that we sell. So let's not forget that. And that's why it's incredibly important when you look at, we've put ourselves against what our European competitors are paying, but also if you look at what our global competitors are paying, the picture is even more stark compared to kind of the industrial energy costs. So I would say, looking back on kind of the last 12 to 18 months, there has been some considerable progress. So that includes the previous government as well. So if you rewind 12, 18 months, we had the industry supercharger package, which was a welcome package that removed some of the levies we paid, that removed some of the charges that we paid to connect to the network, and that did bring down our costs. It didn't bring down our costs as much as we wanted though, so there's still some more work to do in that area, and thankfully through consultations such as the industrial strategy and through the work of the Steel Council, we're seeing this kind of come up again, and a lot of talk around kind of future solutions. So what we've proposed is a kind of short-term solution, which is the increase in relief on the capacity market network charge, which is a charge that we pay to connect to the network, essentially. It's at 60% at the moment. We're looking to bring that up to 90%. That will provide us some much needed short-term relief. And then what we're looking is much longer-term reforms, which is something that's been proposed in the UK, something that's been proposed in Europe as well, to look at kind of how do we bring down the cost of electricity in this country. So that could be things like increasing the use of renewables and decoupling the energy prices in this country from the price of gas. So it's a very kind of big piece of work, but there's lots of energy behind it at the moment, because it's not just the steel industry, it's the industrial competitiveness of the UK that's at stake here. So it's a very important cost.
Because there's no getting away from it. We can decarbonise as best we can, and the electric arc furnace is an example of that. But ourselves and industries like cement and glass, or energy intensive industries, that is the nature of the beast, isn't it? Whichever form of energy is going to be high, and I think to remain competitive, exactly as you said there, it goes on to the price of producing steel. So it's an important one for us. I want to move on a bit now to talk, because we're moving to electric arc furnace. Our raw materials are now not going to be brought from all around the world. They're going to be native to the UK, scrap steel, and we've got a glut of scrap steel in the UK. 10 million tonnes in the UK produced and 8 million tonnes exported. So we're looking to use that. But the scrap market currently isn't mostly set up to supply a domestic market. It's set up to export, understandably. And in your policy briefing document, you've talked about regulating exports of scrap to incentivise retention. You know, this is a free market, isn't it? Don't you just take your choice and live with it?
Well, so at the moment, as you say, we export a hell of a lot of scrap. Actually, I think we're one of the highest exporters of scrap in the world.
Yeah.
So the UK needs to look at how we regulate this resource, because it's going to be an incredibly valuable resource in the future.
Sure.
So if more steel making becomes electric arc furnace based, the demand for scrap in the UK is going to go up. But also just globally, if the global steel industry continues its transition to electric arc furnace steelmaking, the price of scrap is going to significantly increase.
Yeah.
So we need to look at how we retain this valuable resource within the UK. At the moment, it's exported to countries which don't have the same level of regulations as the UK.
Yeah.
So there's kind of an ethical argument for keeping it here. It's an incredibly valuable resource that we should be using in the UK.
Yeah.
But also, there's a business argument for doing so as well, because when it's exported to these other countries, it's then quite commonly re-imported to the UK in the form of, let's say, a car or a radiator.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's incredibly important for us to look at that kind of dynamic as well. And what we're asking for is two things. We're looking at how we retain scrap here in the UK and what regulations need to be applied to retain scrap, incentivise scrap producers, and incentivise that kind of, I guess it's kind of an early market at the moment, because as I've already said, we mostly export scrap at the moment.
Yeah.
So it's an early market, and look at how we support scrap companies across the UK in terms of supplying the future demand for electric arc furnace steelmaking. So it's a kind of two-pronged approach. We need to look at how we regulate the export of scrap and how we support the domestic market, because, Tim, we're going to need a hell of a lot of scrap in the future.
Yeah.
And as I've said already, it's only going to get more valuable as a resource.
Yeah, I think there's a whole nother podcast in the scrap topic, isn't there? And I know people might think there's 2 or 3 years till we get an electric arc furnace, but that work needs doing sooner rather than later, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because many of the policy proposals that we've discussed this afternoon have that kind of 1 to 2 to 3 year implementation timelines.
Yeah.
So we all need it in place before an electric arc furnace is up and running at Port Talbot, but it's going to take a while for it to work through the detail, for that detail to be consulted on, and for that detail to work itself through both chambers of the of Parliament here. So when you consider that, we really don't have as much time as we think we do.
Yeah. Let's move on a bit, because I know there's quite a lot to get through in terms of topics. There's a couple of questions I want to ask you about this sort of private-public collaboration. One of the things in your policy briefing document talks about investing in steel supply chains. So the government's invested in us to move to low CO2 steel. They've got a thing called the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund.
Yeah.
Why is that not enough? Is there more that they should be doing in terms of those supply chains rather than just us makers?
Yeah, so it's there's two issues you've identified there. One is the kind of public-private partnership which is needed with government to invest in further decarbonisation, because we need to remember that our electric arc furnace journey isn't the end of our transition or the end of the story. So we also need to decarbonise our downstream processes, and for that we need a kind of similar level of 50-50 partnership with the government, because the high cost involved at the very beginning and the amount of time it will take to kind of recoup those costs. So in what we've identified in our industrial strategy response is, at the moment we're not seeing that 50-50 partnership. We're often seeing kind of lower levels of funding. Lower levels of funding proposed for these decarbonisation programs that across the company. So I think what we need is a better proposal from government which reflects those kind of the high costs up front and that need for that 50-50 split. So almost further kind of almost mini partnerships with the government to support our decarbonisation of our downstream assets. So, and secondly, I think what you're seeing, what's important to keep in mind when we look at the industrial strategy and the steel strategy is the health of the steel industry in the UK is intrinsically linked to the health of the wider economy, and supporting UK manufacturing to ensure that it has everything it needs to be successful. So I think that link is incredibly important because we're linked to the packaging industry, the automobile industry, the future energy industry, the energy transition. So I think what we've called for is kind of greater recognition of that, and that can be through things like encouraging better guidance on public procurement or private procurement as well, and ensuring that as much UK content is in UK manufacturing as possible. So I guess there's two ways the government can help us. It can directly invest in decarbonising our operations, but then it can also help us in terms of looking at how steel is intrinsically linked to all the other foundation industries it's identified in its industrial strategy.
Yeah, because I guess what people shouldn't forget, Tom, is that this drive to net zero is kind of government legislation. They're the ones who are driving it, and therefore you should have some expectation that they support its implementation through the supply chain. And as you said, steel is fundamental to the UK industrial economy, as are our supply chain. So any support in that area, obviously welcome. Now, the other thing, I guess, to do with supply chains and the industrial economy is that the government is one of the largest procurers of steel for hospitals, for railway stations, for road and infrastructure and stuff. There's a call in your policy briefing document to ensure that UK steel is prioritised in public procurement. Now, that might sound an obvious thing to do, but would it be true to say that should be, in theory, easier now that we're no longer part of the European Union, and that the government has the freedom to specify UK products for UK projects?
So the government does have the freedom to do so, and what it does every year is it refreshes a procurement notice, which is kind of a guidance notice for any public entity when it's planning a kind of construction project or it's buying anything from the open market. So that notice is refreshed on an annual basis, and what we've asked for is kind of two things really. One is that public procurement, so and that UK content should be prioritised in public procurement. And the other is, well, what can we do to incentivise the private sector as well? Because the two go hand in hand, and the private sector is obviously huge as well. It's a huge market for us. So the government can further kind of strengthen its policies in that area, definitely. And if you look at let's say the US, for example, they've had some very successful initiatives in the US where, Buy America has been encouraged, and the Inflation Reduction Act prioritised US content in both private and public sector contracts. So I guess what we're looking for is procurement with more teeth and a better kind of implementation of it. And there are many helpful things the steel industry is doing. So as well as that kind of working with the government on that procurement notice, we're also looking at things like a catalogue, which publicly accessible catalogue, which ensures that anybody can look at what steelmakers in the US and the UK make. And how long it takes to make, etc. So that's a really welcome initiative, which hopefully will help people make the right decisions in terms of what steel they're buying. Yeah,
and over the last couple of years, UK Steel, our trade organisation, has set up a thing called the UK Steel Charter, hasn't it? Where companies and organisations have signed up to it with the intention saying, look, wherever possible, we'll buy UK steel. So that's not necessarily a government-led thing, but it's another activity that's kind of supporting that sort of sovereignty and UK industrial economy, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at some of the kind of the projects which have been the talk of the town in recent months, so you look at High Speed 2, you look at Heathrow, those are projects will require a great quantity of steel. And if you look at our kind of energy transition and the wholesale changes to our infrastructure which will be required in the next 10 to 20 years, it requires millions of tons of steel. So I think the best way to look at it is, let's ensure that we make it here in the UK and that people know we make it and they can buy it directly from us. Yeah,
definitely. There's a lot to be said there. Buy British campaign coming back. I can see it now, Tom. So listen, you mentioned something earlier. It would be remiss of us not to address it on the podcast, which is the announcement by Donald Trump in America of tariffs for steel and aluminium imports into the USA. I know it's only a day after he announced it. Any immediate thoughts on that? We've been here before. I know going back some years, we used to supply a lot of steel into America, and then it's gone to much less. What's your immediate thoughts on those tariffs, what we can see today?
So my immediate thoughts is the devil will be in detail. I think there's been some further details this morning that it will be a blanket set of tariffs applied to everyone. It will be down to each individual country, like the UK, to negotiate an exemption and at what cost that exemption will be applied. So my immediate thoughts is it goes to show kind of the challenging global environment that we operate in as a global business. As you say, we still export to the US, and in particular we export a lot of packaging and pipes as well, both one of which is made in Trostra, next made in Hartlepool as well. So it's kind of too early to tell. It really depends on how long it will take to get an exemption from these tariffs. If it takes a long time, then the damage will be quite high. If hopefully the UK negotiates an exemption early, or it negotiates the exemptions before they're applied in mid-March, that'd be even better.
Even better.
Time will tell really, and time will be the kind of the measure of the impact.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about it is, as I said, not a massive volume, but it's quite valuable business for us. But a lot of those products we're supplying to America are made in America, so the customers there are hopefully going to lobby their government, say, listen guys, we need these products coming in from the UK, or they might even just have to accept that they'll cost them more. Yeah,
that's correct, Tim. So we know this because actually there's kind of a lot of trade challenges exporting to the US, and we kind of go through this exercise both with the UK government and the US government in terms of what we supply to the US and how it's not made in the US. So as you say, these are specialist products. They're also kind of our high-end products as well. And very valuable to the US consumer, as you said. So hopefully the US government and the US consumer makes the right choice, and we continue to export to what is a fantastic market for us.
Yeah, we should watch that space. Listen, Tom, we're going to kind of start wrapping up because there's an awful lot we've been through. If anyone's really interested in more detail, they can go and have a look at the policy briefing document, which is on our website, and you can read through it there. And I'm sure that we'll be talking about it over the coming months and years as we go through it. But if I was to ask you to sum up, given all of those challenges in the political environment and the policy framework, what are your hopes for the UK steel industry going forward? And if you had one message to these guys in Parliament behind us, what would it be?
I think my single message is now is the time to act. We've got a great opportunity. We've just had the industrial strategy published. We've got the steel strategy in spring. It's a great opportunity for us to all agree on what's needed for the steel industry and the UK's industrial competitiveness, and hopefully move forward at pace, because as I said earlier, we're working on a kind of 18 to 24 month timetable to ensure everything is in place before the electric arc furnace is up and running in Port Talbot. If that ingredients list we've kind of run through for policy is if we have all those ingredients, it will be a success story. So now is time to act and to move forward as quickly as possible.
Listen, Tom, thanks very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure talking to you as ever, and going through all those policy things. So it's quite heavy in many respects, but it's so critically important for the business. And I kind of said at the beginning of the podcast that everyone talks about the electric arc furnace, and it's not necessarily the silver bullet, but it's going to take us on a road to low CO2 steel making. But the importance of this policy framework over the next few years just cannot be underestimated. And I'm delighted that you and your colleagues have managed to put that together. Clearly, I'm delighted, to see the level of engagement we've got with politicians who I know are coming to our site, and you're meeting them here, and their advisors and the groups, and UK Steel working so hard on similar levels of legislation. And fingers crossed, over the next 2 or 3 years, we can start to see some movements on those things, which will secure the future of the UK steel industry. So thanks again for coming out.
Tim, it's been a pleasure.
On a cold February day, but we're in the right place, and if only we can persuade them to listen to this podcast, then maybe we'd all be in a better place. But listen, thanks very much.
Thank you.
So there you have it, another fascinating podcast about decarbonising the UK steel industry, this time focusing on the policy environment in which the UK steel industry and other energy intensive industries have to operate. I'm sure we'll be coming back to this topic over the months and years to come. If you've liked the podcast, please do subscribe or like it. It's available on all our usual platforms. We're promoting it through our social media channels at Tata Steel UK, and also you'll be able to watch this video on YouTube as well as previous podcasts that we've recorded. Just to whet your appetite a little bit, the next couple of podcasts we're hoping to film will be coming straight from Port Talbot. Firstly, with Peter Jones, who's the programme manager for the electric arc furnace programme. He's going to walk us around where those changes are going to happen in the heavy end of the steelworks in Port Talbot. And secondary with Andrew McGregor, who's leading the Mills development, which is much less talked about, but it's again part of the £1.25 billion investment in Port Talbot. He's going to talk to us about the improvements to the hot rolling mill in Port Talbot and the brand new pickle line, which even on its own is a major investment in the site. So watch out for those two podcasts coming to a screen near you soon. Thanks very much for watching.